You've taken Biden and replaced him in a sense almost with a generic Democrat. I mean, nobody knows much about Harris. She's not letting anybody define her. She's had the media all to herself. She hasn't been asked a single question by anyone from the media. It's like great. Hello out there in podcast land. I'm your host for the Liberal Patriot podcast, Ruy Teixeira. And in this podcast, we aim to bring you the very finest and heterodox conversation and analysis with the very most interesting guests. So I'm very happy today to have Kristen Soltis Anderson, an old pal of a sort, to talk to us today. Kristen is a founding partner of Echelon Insights, which is a GOP polling firm, one of the top ones. And in my opinion, she's one of the most astute political analysts around and always worth listening to. Kristen is also a contributing opinion writer at the New York Times, helps them run their focus groups. I guess you're regularly on CNN. And maybe a lot of people don't know this anymore, but you did write a book a while ago that was quite interesting called The Selfie Vote, Where Millennials Are Leading America and then How Republicans Can Keep Up. And I thought that would be an interesting place to start. It came out in 2015, which seems like a million years ago. And at the time, you were basically warning Republicans, because you are a Republican, you work for a GOP polling firm, and you're sort of oriented that. You're saying, hey, you gotta wake up to the way the country's changing, especially the younger generations. You've got to figure out, you don't give up your principles, but you got to figure out a way to communicate with these emerging demographics, again, particularly people on the young side. And you had a lot of, I thought, pretty good advice about how to do that. But it's interesting that came out in 2015 , right? And a year later, Trump gets elected with completely, ignoring all that advice. So what did you make of it at the time, where it seemed like you gave all this good advice, people discarded it, at least Trump did, and, somehow he managed to win. What was your take on what you missed or what you still got right and so on?
Yeah, so the selfie vote, I wrote it during 2014, and you're right, it came out summer of 2015. It actually came out, I think, a week or two after Donald Trump took his fateful trip down the Golden Escalator.
Down the staircase. Oh, wow.
So
okay.
If you pull up the book and you do a Control F, you will not find the word Donald Trump in this book, and that is because that wasn't a thing that was going to happen when I filed the manuscript. So it is in some ways a book from the alternate timeline where Republicans nominate Marco Rubio in 2016, it's definitely written for a very different moment in political time. It's like a weird time capsule. And interestingly enough, at my company this week, my younger staffers, a bunch of Gen Zers, they're all using the selfie vote as the book club book. So I'm excited to get roasted for it, for how disconnected it is from today. But here's my defense of the value of it, is that I still maintain, Donald Trump notwithstanding, that Republicans have a young voter problem. And that it has been slow burning but continuous. You see it pop up in poll results that show voters in their 30s and early 40s breaking away from the GOP, even at the same time that the Gen Xers have become a pretty Republican group. And even the polls nowadays, before Biden and Harris switched out at the top of the ticket, which I'm sure we'll dive into, you were seeing these polls showing younger voters breaking for Trump, and people were like, see, look, this proves Republicans were able to win them back. And I said, I don't actually think this is about young voters being won over to the GOP or conservatism. I think this is just they can't vote for Joe Biden and they think he's too old. I don't think this is what you think it is. And so sure enough, we've already begun to see those signs that as soon as you switched out the top of the ticket, we are reverting back to factory settings, that younger voters are going back to doing what I kind of predicted they would do, which is continue to be more progressive until Republicans have a message that can reach them. So in one sense, writing that book and then watching the Republican Party light a lot of it on fire was very dispiriting.
Set it gaily ablaze, they did. Warmed their hands.
But they're also, but there's another interpretation, which is if you had told me in the summer of 2015, when the book came out, that Republicans were going to nominate someone who used social media and data to target people very effectively, to drive a message online that was very persuasive, that would stand up at a Republican convention and use the acronym LGBTQ, which if you go back and you read Donald Trump's speech from 2016, he does.
Right.
I would have said, oh my gosh, that's great. Who did we nominate? Marco Rubio? So there are some things.
Right. Yeah.
It's interesting. People, I think, assume they go, oh, Donald Trump came in and did the opposite of, remember the GOP autopsy after the 2012 election?
Yes.
Okay, we got to figure out what's wrong. What most people took away from that was that Republicans were getting the advice, you need to moderate on immigration, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But if you actually look at a lot of the tactical advice therein, besides the finding about immigration, which Donald Trump obviously did not take, he actually did a lot of the things in the report. Like of the 70-some things it recommends, 40 or 50 of them are very tactical about organizing, fundraising, using data, and so like in a weird way, we think of Donald Trump as the candidate who did the opposite of what the autopsy recommended. He just did all the things that weren't sexy and didn't get headlines.
I think that's a good point. Yeah.
So it's reflecting on it now, in some ways politically light years away from that moment. I still think there are things about it that hold true. That Republicans have continued. Republicans thought that the problem they had with young voters was purely an Obama problem and not an ideas problem. And it was an ideas problem. It still is an ideas problem. And the chaos of Donald Trump and Joe Biden putting two 80 or almost 80-year-old men against each other in a race kind of distorted some of how that has played out in a way that is now sort of coming back into normal focus with Harris at the top of the Democratic ticket.
Yeah, well, let me push back a little bit on the idea we're reverting to factory settings here. I mean, clearly Biden was doing quite poorly among younger voters. Sort of depends on how we define young. Millennials aren't really young anymore. Sorry to break this to you, but
no, I'm aware.
But he was really underperforming, and now we see that margin improving for the Democrats. However, if you look at the poll averages, they're still, even Harris is still running behind where Biden ran in 2020. We're still not seeing regularly these 20-plus percentage point margins for the Democrats among voters under 30. And I think this is an interesting point I really wanted to bring up with you about the millennial generation, because obviously most pollsters don't do generational breakouts. So we do regularly get 30 to 44, which really coincides with the bulk of this point of the millennial generation. It's almost like a millennial demographic. And the New York Times poll that came out recently, and I think this is very consistent with what we've seen generally, only has Harris at +4 among the millennials, right? So again, these are not 18 to 29-year-olds anymore. These are 30 to 44-year-olds. So it does make me wonder what's going on there, whether, in fact, as this cohort has gone through the life course and political events, they may, in fact, becoming more Republican. Pew doesn't break out generations anymore, but they do break out decadal cohorts. And recently, Pew had some data that showed the 1980s cohort, again, the early millennials, people like you, going from +22D in party ID to +8D. So those are pretty big shifts. It doesn't make them, a non-progressive or reactionary or super pro-Republican generation, but it does make them less oriented in that direction. So I wonder what your reaction is to that. I mean, despite maybe Republicans not paying as much attention to this as they should, or doing it exactly the right way, in fact, there does appear to be more give there toward the Republicans away from the Democrats than we might have thought a few years ago.
So I have two reactions. The first is that I am curious and have seen some evidence. I think the smart folks at Split Ticket did this analysis that basically showed that most of the shift rightward that you see generationally is less somebody who was, say, progressive during the Obama era, deciding that they are somehow now Republican. And it is more that young people who were politically engaged during the Obama era were more progressive. And that since then, young, more rightward leaning people who may not have voted or paid much attention in their 20s have kind of entered the electorate. So you're changing the composition, which I think is interesting and compelling. But I also don't dismiss the idea that there are some young people for whom what I always heard Republican consultants telling me, oh, they're going to get older and reality is going to hit them and they're going to hate paying taxes and they're going to suddenly be out of step socially with the young kids and they're going to be Republicans, right? And it wouldn't surprise me if there isn't some truth to that. Like, think about the way that what we consider a social progressive has changed in 20 years. Barack Obama opposed same-sex marriage in his run for president in 2008, right? And now that's like, so the world of what we even consider to be progressive versus moderate, right versus left, has changed a lot. So it could be that someone held a certain set of views and then the world changed around them. That's explanation number 2. But explanation number 3 is that you do have some of this individual level change. And I don't totally dismiss it, but I do think that Republicans got too self-assured at the notion that, young people are all going to get older and they're all just going to vote for us. But that shift would have to be so dramatic to make up for the fact that they were starting from such an unusually progressive starting point. That young voters have not always been 2-to-1 D to R, as they were during especially that kind of early Obama era. And so to move young voters to even what you might normally expect from a middle-aged voter profile would take a lot of heavy lifting. And I'm still not totally convinced that we're there. So I could be totally wrong. The exit polls could come back from this Harris-Trump election, and they could show that Donald Trump actually closed the gap with millennials to single digits. And I would be not enormously surprised, but I'll admit right now, I would be somewhat surprised if that happens. But I just wonder if we don't get to a point where millennials have just had such a habit of thinking of Republicans in such unpleasant terms for so much of their political lifetime that it is just really hard for them to get there and pull the trigger for a Republican, especially an unusual Republican, like I would characterize Donald Trump. Well, I guess he is now not. Unusual might be the wrong word, but his brand of Republican.
Right. Well, I mean, it doesn't seem to me, though, one needs to, the automaticity of becoming more conservative as you get older, and that will fix generational cohort problems. I think we could discard that as being just kind of a dogma almost. But that doesn't mean that there aren't things that might happen to a given cohort that would send them in a different direction. For example, the Democratic Party itself has changed in the last 10 or 15 years in a way that is clearly much more liberal and left on a lot of these issues. And, if they'd stayed where they were, they might not have some of the problems they have. Because even though, by and large, millennial generation voters, for example, lean left on, general sociocultural or climate issues, they're not that left, right? So there's a possibility the Democrats are leaving some of these voters behind, even as the party changes. Another thing, of course, it's really important is like what's happening with their lives, right? What's happening with the economy? What's happening with the state of social disorder? What's happening with home prices? I mean, there's all kinds of things that can push a given cohort away from their originally preferred party that have nothing to do with the automatic process of aging, but just have to do with how the country's changing. So I guess what I'm arguing is that, I think they may be set up, the Democrats, for compressed margins, but not a drastic plummeting of their margins, but nevertheless compressed margins. And I wouldn't be surprised to see it among millennials in particular, because again, we do see the shifting party ID data that I mentioned from Pew. But you know what? I guess we'll see. I mean, that's why they hold the elections and we get to do nose counts, because right now we're all just speculating based on existing data. But it sounds to me like you're more bearish on the younger generation vote for the Republicans at this point.
I am. I think that the millennial generation is going to be permanently is a strong word, but permanently have a sort of left-leaning bias toward them relative to older or younger voters at this point. Because I think Gen Z
plus 20D versus plus 10D is a big difference, right? So
yeah.
But
I'm still bearish on the notion that you're going to see younger voters and older voters voting similarly. Like, I think that we're just back to having that generational polarization, and that it's going to continue creeping upward in the age spectrum as millennials like me. Trust me, no one needs to tell me that millennials are getting old. I feel it every day when I want to go to sleep at 9:30 p.m. I'm like, I used to watch The Daily Show like every day. Who stays up until 11? What is that all about?
Really? What's that about? Exactly. Well, let's talk about the gender gap a little bit, because it does intersect with the generational issues and so on. If you look at the way the gender gap has evolved in the last 15 years, it was in 2020, it was sort of, I would say, average-ish. It was a little higher under the first Trump election. But now we're seeing in recent polls, a widening of the gender gap. I mean, on average, and then if you look at, for example, that New York Times poll, which I always like to reference because, it's a really high-quality poll, it's pretty recent, it does look bigger than we've seen for quite a while. So what's that about? What's driving it, do you think? And how much is this a reflection of younger cohorts where that gap may be widening? Do you have data on this or just views?
So I think it is a lot about younger voters. And I defer to the great work of Daniel Cox on this. He is the one who has really dug deep in the data around the gender gap specifically for Gen Z and how... Yeah. So let's think back to when I wrote the Selfie Vote 10 years ago. I was writing about social and cultural issues, and I actually don't really talk in the book that much about abortion as an issue. I mention it, and I say, there's a lot of conventional wisdom that says women and young people, they're very different than older people, but actually the data don't really bear that out, that the gender gap on abortion was much smaller than people thought, the generation gap much smaller. That's no longer the case. Like, that is a finding from 10 years ago that no longer really holds up, that now you do have especially young women, and it's not just that they are much more likely to say, I believe abortion should be legal with almost no restrictions, but it is also that they're more likely to be kind of activist on the issue, that they are more likely to say that it is critical to how they view politics. So I do think that abortion is one piece of it. But I also think that you have seen Republicans, to the extent that they are making a very explicit play for young voters, it is toward young men. It was very funny. So today I was working on a bit of a piece where I was trying to find polling on who are fans of professional wrestling, because you'll recall at the Republican convention, you had Hulk Hogan show up.
Hulk Hogan,
Donald Trump's always going to these things. And I found a Gallup poll from 25 years ago, 1999, summer of 1999 poll. They were polling because Governor Jesse the Body Ventura, the governor of the great state of Minnesota at the time.
I remember him well.
Governor of Minnesota, not saying that that's relevant to the news cycle or anything, but he had, I guess, participated as sitting governor. He had participated in a WWE event that year. And so they were polling whether people thought that was an appropriate use of the governor's time. But they also wrote up who in our poll is a wrestling fan. And it said, okay, they're likely to be younger. They're likely to be male. They're likely to not have a college education. They're likely to have a lower income. And then they said, and they're likely to vote Democratic. And I thought, oh, I was with you until the end of that. That's the part that's so different. If I am going to point to a segment of the youth vote that there actually has been pretty intentional outreach to, and that has really seemed to resonate, it is Republican outreach to young men, particularly young men without a college degree. Whether it's around issues like cryptocurrency, whether it's, there's a whole host of things where Donald Trump and his version of the Republican Party have made a pretty explicit appeal. And it is not the sort of thing that if you are a progressive woman who hears JD Vance talk about childless cat ladies and gets really ticked off and offended for understandable reasons. Like, you are not the audience.
Definitely
Donald
not.
Trump's audience is the person who makes that kind of a joke. And we're going to find out in the election who has numbers on their side. But I thought that was such an interesting finding that, like, if we are going to say that there is an explicit campaign on the part of Republicans to reach a demographic that did not always vote Republican, one of them is this young men, Gen Z type group.
Yeah, you can certainly see it I think in some of Dan Cox's data on party ID. You see this big difference in how the party ID and on ideology, how that's trending between young men and young women. Young men either staying the same or becoming more conservative, and young women become much more liberal. And I would suspect, if you break that down by college, non-college, you'd see even sharper differences. I mean, part of this makes sense, right? Because young men are, they have a different life experience these days. I mean, Richard Reeves is all over this at the Brookings Institution about how, if you look at how men are progressing economically, socially, and other ways, I mean, they really feel like they're falling behind, and there's a pretty good reason for this. They are. So, they feel like, they're kind of being frowned upon by the powers that be and by the Democrats. And actually, they're kind of getting screwed, or at least that's the way they feel about it. And, again, you look at the data that just came out from Raj Chetty, and that would also suggest that young white men are having a pretty difficult time of it. And again, particularly if they're non-college. So all that makes sense. As you say, it's sort of a numbers game. If you push on that demographic, if you're Trump in the Trump-Vance campaign, do you lose so many people on the other side that it actually nets out negative for you? We just don't know at this point. But that is certainly a wild card too, in how these cohorts are going to evolve. These younger cohorts, this male-female split, that does seem to be increasingly salient. So do you think it's really for the young women? Is it really mostly about abortion and feeling like young men are just troglodytes, or what's it really about? What are they thinking, these young ladies? I know they're a little younger than you are, right? But what's your take?
Yes, and I think those are elements. I wouldn't say that it's all of it. I don't think that, for instance, abortion is the number one issue. I've described it as a deal breaker issue, that it's not typically the thing that people say they're the most likely to use as the decision maker. But then if you actually press on them and you say, oh, well, this person, they agree with you on economics and this and that and the other, but they support an abortion restriction at 15 weeks. And then they're like, even if that's a policy that in and of itself actually tests reasonably well and is viewed as like kind of moderate, the minute for a lot of especially young women that they hear you want to restrict it at all, it's like it sends up this alarm like, I don't know if I trust you. I don't know that I think that you're on my side on this. And so and frankly, there is so much more. I think the other thing that is really causing this interesting divide is that the ways in which we get political news now are so integrated with the ways that we get other kinds of information. What I mean is, like, social media kind of tears down this wall between I am going to go watch the nightly news and learn what's happening with current events, and now I'm going to pick up my fashion magazine and I'm going to learn what's happening in style, or I'm going to pick up my celebrity gossip magazine and learn what's going on with J-Lo and Ben Affleck. That's a very old millennial topic to care about. I don't know that Gen Zers actually care about them. But so here's an example of this. And I've talked about this a lot as like the perfect example of a politician getting it right. AOC, she popped up on a podcast or a creator's show that was a skincare and beauty influencer. And she popped up on the show to talk about the U.S.'s kind of backwards regulations around sunscreen. If you travel abroad, you can get really good sunscreen. And here in the U.S., we regulate it in a way that's very strange. So you can't get like the best sunscreen here in the U.S. And so she shows up on this podcast and it exposes her to this audience that is not actively looking for information about like, ooh, I would like to know what the squad is up to today. They're literally just watching this influencer to learn about skincare and SPF and how to protect yourself from the sun. And there's AOC delivering messaging, being present, being there. And I find that Democrats in particular are very good about being there in spaces, especially that young women are following online. Just the other day, there's an influencer that I follow. Her name is like Lawyer Erica. She's always in my feed giving people advice on things like, if your flight gets delayed, here's how to make the airline pay you for your time. So I'm watching it, and all of a sudden, Secretary Buttigieg like pops up in this girl's video. These things are very smart. I feel like Republicans sometimes dismiss the whole influencer thing as like embarrassing nonsense. And it's not. What it is if you find the right creators, influencers, content, places, you are getting yourself in a place that people are not looking for political news. All of which is to say, the types of things that a young woman and a young man are going to follow on Instagram, they might be a lot of overlap, but there are going to be some things that are pretty distinct. And so as we segment ourselves more and more into these information silos, it's not just Republicans watching Fox and Democrats watching MSNBC. It is that now we can tailor our information consumption so specifically to our own needs, desires, and interests that a large number of young men may never see anything that is even remotely similar to what young women are seeing on social media. And so for a generation that's primarily getting their information about the world through these platforms, it doesn't surprise me that we're seeing even greater fragmentation.
So do you think Republicans are kind of dropping the ball on this stuff? I mean, there were some influences I remember at the Republican convention. Are they becoming more aware of this and working harder, or are they just so far behind it's kind of hopeless?
Well, so the ones that Republicans are reaching out to are just very different. So, for instance, I think Donald Trump is buddies with Logan Paul, who is a big YouTuber and influencer. Yeah. I was trying to understand professional wrestling here. It's like I feel it's an important obligation to do so if I want to understand the current political environment. So Logan Paul was wrestling at SummerSlam this weekend. So if you follow him, he's an influencer. You're probably voting for Donald Trump. And so that's why actually bringing out someone like Amber Rose at the Republican convention was actually such a big coup for them, because she does have an audience that is probably not mostly Republican. So she's actually a great example of Republicans doing something very different and unconventional and could be very beneficial if they had more of that. But I do think that in general, your median beauty influencer, fashion influencer, what have you, the ones that women are consuming more of, I think you're seeing more progressive messaging and Democratic politicians engaging in those spaces, where for Republicans, it's more video game streamers and that sort of thing.
Right. Yeah, we'll score one for the Ds on that front. Well, we might as well segue to, there has been some political news lately, as you're probably aware. So let's talk a little bit about where we are, what's happening since the great Biden switcheroo, when the Democrats seamlessly cashiered him and put Harris in his place. Is this just a big honeymoon? I mean, we look at the data, the polls, and clearly it's closed enormously, and depending on which average you look at, Harris is even slightly ahead in some of them. So what's that all about? Is it really just, she's basically, you've taken Biden and replaced him in a sense almost with a generic Democrat. I mean, nobody knows much about Harris. She's not letting anybody define her. She's had the media all to herself. She hasn't been asked a single question by anyone from the media. It's like great. It's like sort of uninterrupted positive coverage for 2 weeks. Is it just that, or is it that it's like the very fact of being not Biden and not Trump? I mean, that's just so good as far as a lot of somewhat persuadable voters are concerned that that's all you need. So what's your assessment of why the race, at least as we look at it from the polling data, has changed as rapidly as it has in the last couple of weeks?
I think there is definitely a component of voters who said, please give me somebody besides Biden or Trump, getting their wish and just being a little bit relieved about that. That does not mean that they will continue to love Kamala Harris, but at least for the moment they do. And she has the clock on her side. So let's see. She's going to name a vice president. Vice presidential nominee. She'll get a good, couple of days news cycle out of that. Then not too far away, you're into the Democratic convention. That is a week-long commercial for your party and your party's message and all that. Okay, so then we come out of the Democratic convention, you're approaching Labor Day weekend, and then suddenly it's the first debates, which may or may not happen. But you also have early voting starting in a lot of places, not too far after that. Right. So this is, by not having to compete in a Democratic primary, I have described this as a cheat code in a video game. Like, you just get to skip past all of the levels that would be hard and unpleasant, and you just get to skip right to the end to fight the big bad boss, and that's it. You get to fight Donald Trump. You don't have to fight, Amy Klobuchar. You don't have to fight Pete Buttigieg. You just get to go straight to the end. That is a huge gift.
Sure.
And this compressed timeline means that she'll have a level of party unity she might not have had otherwise. The glow of the positive coverage may be hitting at just the right time. Now, I do feel like there's been a little bit of whiplash because I was in Milwaukee for part of the Republican convention. It was shortly after the assassination attempt on Donald Trump, which has been weirdly memory hold. And I don't have like a conspiratorial thought behind why. It's bananas to me that Donald Trump was a millimeter away from being grievously wounded. And we have, that's not even close to one of the top 5 stories right now. But so anything can happen. And Republicans a few weeks ago, it felt to me very Hillary Clinton 2016. Like, okay, we've got this. Let's start measuring the drapes in the White House again. And how the tables have turned. But it almost at this point, I feel like Democrats are almost back in Hillary Clinton 2016 mode now themselves. Like, oh, thank goodness. Now that we've got rid of this Biden problem, we are smooth sailing. America will never vote for this Donald Trump guy again. They were only liking him because they didn't like Biden. And I think that's an overcorrection too. This is a close race for a reason. And I think both parties are behaving very confidently, as if they cannot fathom that anybody could possibly, how could you possibly vote for Kamala Harris is kind of a conservative thought, right? She has been so caricatured in conservative media pretty easily over the last few years because of somewhat unusual statements she makes, things that have become meme fodder. Republicans who watch a lot of conservative media just cannot fathom how anyone would ever vote for Kamala Harris. And of course, progressives cannot wrap their minds around the idea that anybody, especially post-January 6th, post-convictions, post all of this, would ever vote for Donald Trump.
Yeah, that's the world I live in. I can testify to that. Everybody I know is like, how could anyone vote for Donald Trump? It's ununderstandable. It's like people,
our job is to
from
understand
Mars who vote for Trump. They just can't get their minds around it. That's I think a good portrayal of where we are now. I do think both parties have a kind of perhaps not entirely the correct perception of what's really going on here, and go from various flavors of overconfidence. I mean, if you look at the rolling averages from RCP at this point in 2016, Hillary was ahead by about 6.5 points. I think Biden by 7 points in 2020. So, Democrats are still far away from where they were in those 2 elections, which were both close and one of which they lost. So there might be some reason to not be quite so overconfident. I mean, I think on the Republican side, on the conservative side, I definitely have this sense, and people have written about this, that a lot of it is they just feel like mad because it's so unfair. Kamala Harris gets to walk back all her positions by making a statement, and nobody gets to even ask her about it. Nobody's grilling her. No one's holding her feet to the fire. When Donald Trump says something awry, I mean, he just, even if there's a grain of truth to that, it's just covered as if, this guy is like the worst man on the planet. So I think they're somewhat correct perception that Harris is getting an easy ride of it. And the media, by and large, the dominant media, they are pretty sympathetic to the Democrats, and they're not inclined to give the other side much of a break. And if things seem to be going well on the Democratic side, they will cover it with pretty rapturously. All that's unfair, but that's, life isn't fair, as Jimmy Carter so memorably said a long time ago. You got to win. You got to deal with the situation you got, and it doesn't do any good to get mad about how unfair it is. That won't get anyone on your side. So I mean, do you agree with that? You think that's part of the problem here? They can't get over their mad and just deal with the situation as it is.
Yes, I'm baffled that Republicans seem to have been caught so flat-footed by the change up at the top of the ticket, because frankly it seemed on the morning of June 28th that like this was where this was going to have to head at some point, and the Aaron Sorkin-y fantasies about some like magical process moderated by Lin-Manuel Miranda or whatever, right. That always seemed like nonsense Fantasyland type stuff. I say as an avowed Sorkin brain person sometimes, like I get it. I get the temptation to think that stuff's going to happen, but it's not going to happen. So this was where this was always going to go. And it is wild to me that the Republican message for so long was like trying to use Kamala Harris as like, oh, don't vote for Biden because you might have to have Kamala Harris as president instead. And now that she's actually the nominee, it feels very disjointed, like what the message is. Is the message that she's too liberal? Is the message that she's a phony? Is the message that she is unqualified? It seems, which each of those messages has its own challenges and advantages. But to me, the fact that I, as a heavy news consumer, cannot in one sentence tell you, here's the message against Kamala Harris, is not great. And the fact that it has been so caught up in like this weird stuff about she is both Indian American and black, and like, what does that mean? Yeah,
she had DEI hire, all that jazz.
I mean, some of this is just like Donald Trump can't help himself.
Well, but how much of it is that, Kristen? It's just, the problem isn't that they weren't prepared. The problem is that it's Donald Trump. He can't execute the plan, you know? I mean, they may have had Susie Wiles and La Savita may have had it all worked out exactly how to respond if Harris became the nominee, the presumptive nominee. But, you know, you can have a great plan and then you get punched in the face. And the punched in the face is, in fact, you got to convince Donald Trump to do stuff. And he doesn't want to do stuff. He wants to do what he wants to do. So is this...
I think, and maybe I'll confess to having been lulled into a false sense of maybe Donald Trump is different this time. Like, not fully. Like, I wasn't one of those people gushing like, oh, Donald Trump is so changed. Look at him. But I do think from the minute that he got into that debate with Joe Biden and didn't choose to just mercilessly mock him the whole time, but instead just kind of let it happen, and then stay very quiet for a few weeks, and then go into a Republican convention that people felt like was going pretty well. Like, he made it all the way up until 30 minutes into his speech at the convention.
Right, and then boom.
And then it all started to fall back apart.
Yeah, I thought the speech was like,
again.
You know, that's Donald Trump, but it's a momentary slip. As it turned out, it wasn't just a momentary slip. It's like a switch got turned back on, and he was back to being the Donald Trump we all know and love, I suppose. Yeah, wild stuff. I mean, well, that's not to say he might not get disciplined again, right? I mean, I know, again, Susie Wiles and company, they're going to be beating on him like a drum, trying to convince him to, tone it down. And, there is a very simple message they can have. She's too far left. She's part of the Biden administration. Her policies suck. I mean, you don't want her to be president. Here's why, right? Because she represents all the bad things you've just experienced, and you want good things. You want to experience good things, and that's what you had to undo. I mean, it's not rocket science, but you do have to repeat it over and over and over again. And, I mean, that gets to another question about the race, which I think is kind of interesting. I mean, if you buy, like the polling data we're seeing, and I think the kind of theory of how this might unfold is a little bit like Sean Trendy's bouncing balloon theory, where you, like, ride these, like, mini events of positive coverage all the way to the election, and you keep the focus off what your actual positions are and the actual record of the Biden administration. I mean, is that doable? I mean, have the fundamentals of the race and of how voters seem to be assessing the Biden administration, is it really possible to, in a sense, sort of memory hold all that, all the way up to the convention? All the convention to the voting? Will the press cooperate? I mean, right now, I guess you can't really ask her a question unless they let you ask her a question, but how long can they get away with this without the press getting feisty? They do like a story. They don't like to be manipulated too badly. So, is it possible for this clever strategy and the switcheroo to basically almost wipe out the fundamentals of the race in many ways, which were so negative for
It depends
the
on
Democrats.
whether the press is compliant. Like, I really think that a lot of this is in the hands of the reporters who should be pressing that campaign every day to make her available in an unscripted format to answer basic questions. And these do not have to be gotcha questions. These could be questions as simple as, you said in 2019 that you wanted to ban fracking. Now you say you do not want to ban fracking. Tell me when you changed your position and why. Like, and if
Exactly.
That's not
Simple
a gotcha
questions.
question. That is like
No,
a very
just
friendly, like,
normal.
please, I'm offering you the opportunity to explain why you changed your view. I would love to see a reporter do that. I would be interested in the answers to her questions. But I worry that they are not going to create a situation where she would get asked those questions. A smart debate moderator worth half their salt would ask her those questions in a debate format.
Right.
But she might get to avoid that because of Donald Trump,
Yeah.
and his will I debate her or not or whatever. But look, if I was her, it would I actually think it would be smart for her to say, I will debate you on Fox without a live audience. Like, I actually think her being able to handle Brett and Martha, who are, I think, two good Fox hosts who I don't think are going to be, goofy about it. I actually think that would be a real show of strength for her. If she could say, like, no studio audience, we're not doing that. That's dumb. That's out for debates. But I will debate you, not in front of some goofy audience, but with your Fox hosts. Let's do it. And then I'll see you a week later at ABC. I think that'd be an interesting show of strength. But she also better have good answers to these questions, like, why did you change your position on abolish ICE or the police or
defund them. Yeah, I mean, there's this whole raft of very left-wing, very unpopular positions that at this point she's really just saying, hey, I don't believe that anymore.
Yeah.
No, that's not my position.
This is
no.
also
and it says nobody could ask her about it. It's like she could get away with it. But could you really, again, I mean, okay, let's just say she has some debates. Okay, so she had to answer some questions then. But could she literally go from now until the election and never take questions from reporters?
Potentially.
I mean, it's technically possible, but it seems like, it's kind of a bold gambit. It's almost a certain amount of chutzpah to it.
But I also think that this is where Republicans, by nominating Donald Trump, have put themselves in a bind. Because it's harder to make the case, look at this person who flip-flopped and doesn't have an actual core about anything, when Donald Trump has held different positions on issues.
He certainly has.
All the time.
At least he's willing to be interviewed, yeah.
So this had Republicans nominated anyone else, they might not have had that same vulnerability, but they didn't.
Yeah, I was interviewed by New York Magazine, just came out today, and one thing I said is, we were talking about 2022, and the Republicans only had replacement Senate candidates. They probably would have taken the Senate. And then I had an offhand remark, which I think is true. I mean, Donald Trump is not even a replacement Republican candidate, right? I mean, if you had a Republican candidate who sanded off some of the edges and still had a bit of a populist appeal, just a generic contemporary Republican, I mean, it'd probably be an easier cruise to a victory. Right now, do you think Harris is favored? I mean, I was looking at Nate Silver's model today, and he makes Harris a slight favorite. Do you buy that at this point, or you think it's just still too close to call?
I would say still too close to call. I think the fact that his model, I believe it shows Harris, but by some exceptionally small margin. That to me is plausible. What keeps me up at night is I love polling. I work in polling. Me and my team try to do the very best to put out research that we think is very accurate and representative of where voters are at. The methodology we use is pretty similar in many ways to what Nate Cohn and his team do at New York Times Siena, and they had a pretty good track record. But that doesn't, just because you won the last war doesn't mean you're winning the next war. Right. And I do worry the elections where Donald Trump has been on the ballot have been squirrely. That is the scientific term for it. They have been squirrely.
Right. Squirrely. I know what you mean.
And so, when people say, well, can I trust the polls this time? I'm like, I kind of. I mean, I don't think there's a conspiracy out there. Today, I just wrote a column that's going to go up tomorrow, go up on this week about
you're
how
regularly on Tuesday now on the Times, aren't you?
Yes,
Isn't
yes.
that your schedule?
So
Yeah,
I wrote about
you
how
should look out for that.
the Trump campaign, one of their data consultants, has written this whole thing about how the CBS YouGov poll has manipulated the results because they do not weight by ideology. Which is
I don't know about
pollsters
that.
don't really weight by idea.
Yeah.
Anyhow, but it was like portrayed in this rather conspiratorial, like they're manipulating the results. The Trump campaign spokesman says this is like a national gaslighting campaign, and I thought it's not that, but that doesn't mean that I'm saying the polls are perfect or that I'm trying to come from this place of arrogance that says, like, trust the science. The polls say Harris is up by 1, so she's up by 1. Like,
Right.
no.
Say.
I come at this from a great deal of humility. We could all look very silly the day after the election. We're trying to do our best, but this is very hard to do in a very fluid environment where right now I'm less concerned about the voters who are still trying to decide between Harris and Trump. And I'm more concerned about the huge potential variability in who's deciding between Harris and not voting at all, or Trump and not voting at all. And that's hard for pollsters to predict. It is our job to think it through. But I don't feel at all confident that I'm like, oh, yeah, we've got that figured out. We know who's going to turn out. We're making good, educated guesses, but...
Right. Yeah, no, there's two related problems here. One is, I was going to ask you about this. I mean, differential partisan non-response. We can't at any point know how much of it we're getting. But in a case like this, with the way the campaign has turned in the last 2 weeks, you could easily see Democrats being, hand me that phone or that keyboard. I want to take this damn survey. They're really excited. They're pumped up. So you can get sort of a not representative, even if you control for demographics, kind of sample, and then of course you're getting who are the likely voters. I mean, it's kind of a kind of an alchemist science here, or if science at all, like trying to figure out who these people really are. And there is, and I was curious of your reaction to this, that there's pretty good evidence at this point that Democrats actually benefit when turnout isn't that high. So if we're moving into a pretty polarized environment in this election, which is going to bring some of these peripheral voters who might otherwise have just not bothered into the pool, isn't that actually something that at this point we think should benefit the Republicans and Donald Trump?
Yeah, the Trump era has changed the Republican coalition so that they have shed a number of voters who were high propensity, upscale, suburbanite, whatever you want to call it. People who voted every time, but now are not voting every time for Republicans, but traded that for people who maybe in the past could not have cared less about politics, but they like this guy that they used to watch on The Apprentice, and they think he's cool, and they think he's great, and they think he's fighting for them, and he's ticking off all the people that they don't like. And so sure, they'll go out and turn out and vote for him. And that's why I say specifically that like Donald Trump being on the ballot is what seems to make polling get squirrely. The polls were actually pretty good in the 2022 midterms. Without that factor of Donald Trump involved, they weren't so off. There were some individual statewide races that were like way out there, but in general, it said it was going to be a pretty close race, and it was a pretty close race. But I just think Donald Trump turns out a type of voter who is very hard to find, and that is why you have had the last 2 times he was on the ballot. I think the evidence for the shy Trump voter phenomenon is not great, but I do think it's interesting that the last 2 times Donald Trump has been on the ballot, he has overperformed what the polls suggested he would get. But there's also no guarantee that if there's polling error this time, it will be in that direction. Yeah,
absolutely. Okay, last question. Let's say that, if Trump-Vance wins, we kind of know how the GOP will evolve. It'll probably become more of a Trump-Vancian populist party. But what if they lose? What if Harris does pull it out? It seems quite plausible at this point. What happens to the GOP? Do you have a sense of that? What do you think the fights are going to be? Do you think there'll be, sort of come to Jesus moment? Will they realize, hey, we've gone at least partly down the wrong path here? We need to get our act together, or is it just going to be a bloodbath as everybody accuses everybody else of screwing it up?
So are you familiar with the movie Jurassic Park?
I am.
Okay, so there's a scene for your listeners who may be less familiar. There's a scene that is kind of the kickoff of the final act of the movie, where the park has been offline. They have to go reset the power to the park, and so they send Laura Dern's character, Dr. Ellie Sadler, out to this bunker to try to reset things. And she's in the bunker and she's looking around, and she finally finds the thing, and she's getting the instructions on how to reset the park, and she hits all the switches, and boom, the power turns back on. And she's like, Jurassic Park is back online. We did it. And she's so excited. And as she says that she's so excited, like, she reaches up and grabs like a hand, and it falls like the severed hand of like one of the guys that she was there with, like, falls down. The raptor jumps out. Like, she thinks that everything has just gotten fixed, and all of a sudden it's like, nope, things are not all set. You are not all safe.
Right.
I bring this up to say this is a little bit how I felt after January 6th. I am somebody who thinks that Donald Trump has not been a positive influence in general on the Republican Party. I think it is good that Republicans think more about the concern of the working class. I think it is good that Republicans have now gone looking for voters who are disconnected from the political process. But I think there are a number of things that Donald Trump himself has done to make Republicans behave in a more coarse fashion that I don't think is good or becoming of American leadership, et cetera, et cetera. And January 6th, it goes without saying, very bad. And so after January 6th, there was this like 48-hour period where all of these Republicans are putting out statements. Donald Trump is terrible. Donald Trump, you've got to go. Why would you say this? Oh, good. He's banished and gone forever. Jurassic Park is back online. And then it wasn't. And then very shortly thereafter, here come the Raptors, right? So this is, and he wins the Republican primary with almost no fight. And you can't say, oh, well, gosh, if only somebody else had run against him. No, everybody came off the sidelines and ran. It was Republicans as a party went in clear-eyed and chose Donald Trump, knowing that there were alternatives, knowing what they knew, they picked him. So I no longer believe that there's going to be some rock bottom moment where Republicans go, gosh, I can't believe we've been going down this path for the last however many years. This is bad. This is damaging. Why do we keep losing? We need to move on. I think because if they were going to do that, they would have done it after January 6th. That was it. That was the rock bottom moment. It didn't happen. So I think now when I'm thinking of what the party would do next if Trump loses, I think there's going to be a time where people try to say, let's do Trumpism without Trump. I think, which has never succeeded. Like, the one thing Donald Trump is really good at is he is good at selling Trumpism. But people who have tried to imitate Donald Trump, it never works. And so I think there will be a moment of trying to do this like Trumpism without Trump thing, maybe. But I also think there's not going to be a lot of internal finger pointing. Oh, what did we do wrong? There's going to be a lot of, it was stolen from us. The media was unfair to us, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. And that to me worries me just for the health of our, I think no matter who wins or loses, there's going to be a very painful post-election period of reckoning. But I do worry that that in the event that Donald Trump loses, that is not going to be this like, let us look inward and figure out why voters turned away from us.
Let us reason together. Maybe not.
And I get that, like, we're not going to go back anytime soon to the, like, Romney-Ryan era. There will be something new. But I am not optimistic that there will be some new flower that blooms in the immediate aftermath of 2024 that I think it's going to be ugly. It's going to be ugly.
Yeah, well, I guess we can sum that up by saying watch out for the Raptors,
Watch out for the Raptors.
I think that's good advice, Kristen. Thank you for being on the Liberal Patriot podcast. You've been an outstanding guest.
Thank you for having me.
I wish you the best in your endeavors this campaign season. And, see everybody next time on the next edition of the Liberal Patriot Podcast. We'll be having Julius Krein, the editor of American Affairs, one of my favorite intellectuals and analysts. And until then, this is Ruy Teixeira for the Liberal Patriot, signing off.